Hey there, welcome to this video webcast, Why Business Data Accuracy is Important for Government. It's brought to you by LexisNexis. I'm Christopher Dorobek, the voice behind GovLoop's Dorobek Insider, a blog and podcast that focuses on 6 words, helping government do its job better. And today, it's not just a voice, you get to see me as well. And in fact, you get to see us, well, you will in just a moment. I know I have a face for radio, but as you'll see in just a moment, we have very handsome people here with us and to talk to you. And I can tell you, having had a few conversations with them, they're smart too. Let me introduce them up front. And I know, yes, we look a bit like the Brady Bunch. Well, for those of you who still remember what the Brady Bunch was, it was a TV show, by the way. But let me introduce you to our bunch, Andrea Brandon. She is Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Grants, Acquisitions, Policy, and Accountability at the Department of Health and Human Services. After all those things, Andrea, what's left? You do it all. On the 7th day, do you get to rest? We'll talk to you. Yes, sometimes, I know. Depends on the week. Joa Ayanada, she is Director of the Do Not Pay Business Center at the Treasury Department's Bureau of the Fiscal Service. And Scott Straub, he is Director of Federal Market Strategy at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And we are talking today about data, business data, and data accuracy and why it matters. The interesting thing about the world today, and we'll talk a little bit about this in just a moment, my perception is that by and large, people get that data matters and business data matters. And we've seen that in so many ways. We've all read Moneyball, for goodness sakes, right? But how can you make data useful? How do you make sure that the data is good? How do you know what to save, what not to save? Well, we're going to get to those and many other questions as we move forward today. Before we get to that, let me do a few business items. First off, we'd love to get your questions and comments as we move forward. You can submit questions in the question comment box. You can also tweet questions using the hashtag GLTrain for GovLoop training, so hashtag GLTrain. We will also send a follow-up email in the next few days with an on-demand version of this training so you can watch it again, or if there's a part that you would like to hear again, anything, or you may want to share it with a friend who might find it valuable. There will also be a number of resources that will be included in that email, and we'll tell you more about that as we continue. I introduced them before, but let me introduce them again. Andrea Bolton with the Department of Health and Human Services, Joa Ayanada with the Treasury Department, and Scott Straub, Director of Federal Market Strategy at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. And a couple of them work at interesting organizations, so I'm going to have them talk about what that means. But Scott, let me start with you, because we're talking about business data, and I think it's important to define, and we hear people talk about data all the time. When we talk about business data, what are we talking about? How is business data separate from just data?
So what I wanted to talk about today out there was before I joined LexisNexis, I used to actually work in the same building where Joe works now at the Bureau of Fiscal Service. And everything we did, it was around debt collection. So there was always 2 halves of it. One half was around individuals, which was one thing, and then another half was around businesses. And then for us, like, business data was always difficult. So it's one of the things that the focus for today was really just on the business data aspect of it, meaning simply businesses. Like, these are all these corporations, they request grants, and I'm sure Andrea's going to be involved with that. They get grants, they get loans, and all this other information. So there's a lot of data out there. A lot of people talk about data all the time on individual side, but today I just want to talk about all the other business data that's associated with businesses out there. So that's essentially the difference in why the focus out there today.
And we're going to get a little bit into this business data and why it matters. But Andrea, let me start off with you. You're at the Department of Health and Human Services. You oversee grants, acquisitions, policy, accountability. As I joked, that's a lot there. Talk a little bit about what your organization does and then what business data means to you.
So basically, we award grants more than $600 billion annually across the United States and other countries with regard to biomedical research, substance abuse treatment, Center for Disease Control grants, grants to some of our Indian tribes, etc., for healthcare purposes. And basically, for us, the delineation between our biomedical type of data, our healthcare type of data, and then our business data, which is how we actually run our organization every day, is how I delineate our business data. For instance, our financial data, our human capital data, our different types of financial spend data within our organization here at HHS, our budgetary data for budget execution and formulation, et cetera. So we have various types of data across the department, and that's how I delineate the two types of data.
And Joa, talk about the Do Not Pay Business Center. What is the Do Not Pay Business Center? What does it do? And then how do you use this data?
Sure thing. So the Do Not Pay Business Center has a really important mission, and that is to work with agencies to help them address the government-wide challenge of improper payments. Many of you may know this, but improper payments include both payment errors as well as fraud, waste, and abuse. And we accomplish this mission primarily through data-centric tools. So for instance, we have an online portal that agencies can use to receive the results of automated data matching to a variety of data sources that will help them to detect an improper payment. We also have an analytics service that works with more individual programs to help develop data-centric solutions to an improper payment challenge that might be unique to a particular program. So those are the ways that we're using data. We use data as a data source to help determine eligibility. For example, if we can help an agency determine, I may have just paid someone who is recently deceased, or I may have just paid a business that has recently been disbarred from doing business with the federal government. So those are the kinds of ways that we're using data. And I think for us, it really comes down to the sort of delineation between individuals and business is all about the type of improper payment and the particular solution that will help an agency to ensure the integrity of their payment stream.
And the biggest challenge of getting the biggest data challenge that you face is?
It might actually be data accuracy. There are a variety of data sources out there, and there is no perfect data source. Data sources are as perfect and imperfect as humans are. So having accurate data is the foundation for making good decisions about whether or not to take action on an improper payment, either to prevent that payment from going out the door, or perhaps to institute steps to try to recover that payment. And if you're taking those actions based on inaccurate data, you're going to end up in a lot of heartbreak.
And how are you dealing with data accuracy? How do you handle this? Because I know it's the biggest fear out there. Everyone says, I know data is important, I know it matters, but when it comes to mattering, I got to be able to trust that data at some point, right?
Sure. So there are a couple of ways. I think the most important thing is that as we acquire new data sources, we have to do a lot of testing. And so we do a lot of very rigorous evaluation of the accuracy of the data, how complete is it, how often is it refreshed. There are a lot of data reliability tests that we'll put a data source through before trying to make it available to customers. So that's the step one. So before it ever goes into any sort of use or analysis, we need to evaluate the source itself. Of course, how you use the data matters, but I think data accuracy really comes in at the far side of the process. So I can apply some very clever algorithms to try to identify an improper payment, and then on the far side, we need a process, or the agency has to have a process for weeding out any potential for false positives, and that's where data verification comes in. And those tend to be process oriented. It may leverage additional data, but there may be other steps that an agency will take to ensure that data is telling it to do the right thing.
Andrea, is that also your biggest problem? Is data accuracy, and it's over at Treasury? That's a big thing. How about at HHS? Is that the biggest problem that you have?
I'd say that the data accuracy is not the biggest problem. Our biggest problem is the amount of data that we have. If you can imagine over $600 billion of grants going out, more than 100,000 grant transactions annually, having to ensure that their various sources, as Joe had talked about, the different source systems of where we're getting our data from, we have numerous across the country data sources, and we want to make sure that we do all the appropriate testing and reliability testing on the data, accuracy testing, and all of our validations to ensure that as the data is actually being entered into the system, it's entered correctly. And then as we're doing the comparative analysis between the data and the systems, that it's done, that part is done accurately as well, so that what we're reporting to some of our federal portals, such as usaspend.gov, that data meets the burden of accuracy that we need. And we try to make it at least 90% to 95% accurate rate. So I would say the amount of data that we have and ensuring that all of that data can congeal together to ensure that it tells the right story, and that it's good quality data is our biggest burden.
And how are you dealing with that problem? You mentioned a little bit, but because I think every agency is also there where they're just, the phrase that I always hear people talk about is they're drowning in data. They have it up to here, and so it's a big problem out there. How are you dealing with that?
So, we have both manual methodologies for dealing with it, where we have subject matter experts that are manually verifying the data, as I said, as it's being entered. But we also have technological help where we do different algorithms that are run on the data as it goes through the systems, and as we are actually pulling that data together to ensure that an apple is an apple, that orange is an orange, that the data is actually accurate across the board before we actually make posts or make recommendations. There's various technologies that we use to help ensure that our quality of our data is done well, and we're also looking at artificial intelligence. So it's a huge challenge as a large department, a large federal grant-making department, to ensure that our data is accurate, it's relevant for the posts. But we are looking into all the various technologies, because the less that we can use the manual intervention through humans, the better that we feel the quality of our data will be, and the more that we will be able to get a handle on the large amounts of data that we have, and also be able to use it more to do predictive analysis to help us run our programs and our mission better than we have been.
Scott, you have the advantage of dealing with all sorts of different agencies, and you heard two people with two different ideas of what the biggest problems are. I think they're probably interrelated there, but what are you hearing are the biggest challenges out there?
Well, what it really comes down to it's both of what Joe and Andrea said. There's a quality issue, but then there's also a quantity issue too, because businesses, people. What happens, and back to Joe's point about data accuracy, as people go out and they start to enter the data into the systems, once bad data gets into the system, it's into the system. That's it. Right. And it's just there's errors that are just in there. And then going back to what Andrew is saying, once you get a lot of it, it just becomes really difficult to manage. Yeah. And so kind of what we do as a company is when we aggregate all the data together, we also have several algorithms that run all the time to go ahead and make sure that as we see businesses in various forms, either because there's like large companies out there will have franchisees as well, so there'll be like a mothership company out there, and it all depends for our customers as to what problem it is they're trying to solve. Like there could be a business non-tax compliance problem in a state and local county jurisdiction, for example, where they want to know if this franchisee has a presence in their jurisdiction or not, because then that person should be registered and paying business taxes. Then you can look up and make sure that who owns that store, et cetera. So there's a lot of other problems that start to come into play. And then, so the data accuracy around businesses, it's a big challenge because the data gets used so many different ways, so many different purposes. It has to be categorized and very fungible, so it can be mixed around and just extracted in different ways, because Joe's problems and Andrew's problems and a bunch of other government agencies' problems, they're all a little bit different out there. So it all depends how it's organized, how it's indexed. The unique identifiers, for example, can really help out with that. and how those things are indexed will help them all verify the accuracy in their systems too.
I mentioned at the top that at least my sense is you don't have to convince people that data matters these days. Is that a correct assumption to make?
That's correct. Yeah, everybody's now, as time's moved on, they're this, once everything started to go digital several years ago, now all of a sudden the data is just kind of everywhere. So the data, The Economist did a really great article a few weeks ago talking about data as the new oil. Which is pretty true. Data pretty much runs everything we do. We walk around town, you see everybody looking at an iPhone trying to find where they're going in town and things to that effect. You interact with businesses on these little devices now, but that's all just a digital footprint. So everybody understands that it matters. So all of a sudden the accuracy of the data is becoming more and more important to everybody else, so they can just go ahead and do their jobs.
So we heard the amount of data, the data accuracy. What are some of the other challenges that you see out there?
So what happens is that some people will go ahead and take a look at it and say, well, how can I go ahead, one of the areas what I focus on is fraud. Joe mentioned before about improper payments. Not all improper payments are fraud. We were discussing that before the session began. But there are some people out there that will go ahead and businesses, they'll go ahead and start the serial incorporators, for example. They'll go ahead, start a small business, get a loan, make a couple payments on it, and then it'll default on it. Well, then the owners of those businesses will reincorporate it again there and go back at it and do it again. So, but there is no tie initially between, it could be Straub Enterprises one day, then, Straub LLC the next day. It's still me running the business, but there has to be a mapping behind, well, who's actually behind that business is, because some instances for businesses represent people, because people incorporate businesses. Businesses don't just happen and don't just spring up overnight. So that's one of the things that'll happen is knowing and understanding who is behind those businesses and then how those other businesses are related to other people.
And Joe, talk a little bit about how it is my assumption correct that basically people get data now. It's just it's a question of how you use it in the right way, right?
That's exactly right. Everybody knows that data is important. Everybody knows that analytics are important. A lot of times we don't always know what that means, but we know it's important. I think the challenges that we were just talking about related to how you use data is really critical. I was just thinking about the fact that, some of the, there are a couple of really important government data sources that track business entities that have been disbarred or are no longer permitted to work with the federal government. And what Chris was talking about of the sort of serial reincorporation, that's extremely challenging for the government. And developing a process and a concept for when is it appropriate to make those links? When do we consider the data to be accurate so that when a company reincorporates, we can make those links so that it's harder for that entity to skirt some of the requirements that they're not allowed to do business with the feds anymore. So I think that's a really key challenge. The information is there, but I think our processes for making decisions and acting on that data are a little bit farther behind.
Yeah, and Andrea, I'm curious as to how you convince people. Did you have to convince people that data matters and business data matters, or is that something that just is in the bloodstream now?
I think that it's pretty much in the bloodstream. We do a lot of annual reports. They're public on our website. We have lots of key performance indicators across the department and across the federal government where we have to report on various report cards, if you will, And so we use various data in order to make up those particular report cards. Are we red in a certain area? Are we green in a certain area? Do we have a high risk in another area? How are we mitigating that risk, et cetera? And so I think it's expected that we have data in order to back up our analysis and what it is that we're trying to relate to the public and why we're making certain decisions in the manner that we do. So I think that it's data is expected. It's not something we have to convince people of. I think what we do have to convince people is that we have the right data and that our data is accurate and reliable, and that being used for the right purposes.
And I want to get all of you to talk, and we have a question related to this, but all of you to talk a little bit about this data accuracy question, because it just seems so critical. And if the data isn't accurate, then everything else, all the benefits all of a sudden don't matter. So, Andrea, how do you ensure that you have the accuracy? You mentioned you do checks and balances, and Joa mentioned that as well. But is this software based, or is this really people?
It's both. It's both right now. We're still in the process of making everything electronic. So I'd say we're half and half across the department. So what that means is a lot of our business processes are still being done manually, which means there's manual data entry into our various systems. And so we have to have different segregation of duties, compliance checks, et cetera, to ensure that the business process is being done correctly, so that the data that's entered as a result of that business process is accurate data. And then once that data is entered, as I said, we have multiple sources of data that supposedly captures probably about 80% of the same data for various reasons across the department. So then we have to ensure through reconciliation processes, which we use algorithms through our technology, that we have the same data. It's apples to apples, oranges to oranges, that the quality of the data meets the intent of whatever it is we're using it to measure, that type of thing. So it's both. It's actually both manual and technological.
I see Scott nodding, but Joa, let me get you in here, and then I'll get Scott in here to talk a little bit about data accuracy and how you deal with that.
Yeah, I have to agree with Andrea. It is both about the technical skills and the data itself, as well as the human interaction. So at Do Not Pay, we really are dealing with data accuracy in two of the phases of making a decision and taking action. So because we are providing access to particular data sources, making sure that there aren't any technical problems with the data, that we are refreshing our analysis on the reliability of that data. Those are all really important and foundational steps that we need to take to ensure that we're providing good information to agencies that are collaborating with us. And then secondly, there are always opportunities to refine the algorithms that you're using for data matching, that you're using for entity resolution, that you're using to detect high-risk payments and anomalies in data. There are always opportunities to do that, and refining those are really important.
Scott, and I'll have you address this question from Kimberly. She works in Maryland. What type of system do you recommend for an agency to keep track of data? And I think that has to do with a little bit with data accuracy, and I'll circle back with the others. But Scott, talk a little bit about data accuracy and then systems that folks use that are out there.
So what I'm
guessing LexisNexis may have some systems, maybe.
We do. As a matter of fact, coincidentally. And so what I'll put my old hat back on from back at Treasury out there. This is one of the things that was a big frustration, for me. There's hundreds of billions of dollars owed in delinquent receivables back to the federal government and to state and local governments as well. It's probably over $1 trillion, especially when you include education debts. But what happens, though, is that we didn't always know who to collect the debt from, which sounds kind of weird, because one of the other agencies would refer it over to Treasury, and that data, as it would come over, would be really, really old out there. And the other thing that happens is that with the lack of a consistent, unique identifier in the country, we would have, let's say the example is the newspaper company, right? Well, the newspaper company can have many distribution outlets. They can have an office that has a lot of writers in it. You could have an editorial office down the street somewhere else. Well, then all of a sudden, there's multiple footprints behind this agency, and they could also have separate corporations underneath it. So everything got really complicated. So way back in the old days with fiscal service, we go into the database and say, okay, we know we have this debt that's owed out there. There's a person, they're asking for payment. Right? And then all of a sudden we look at it and go, well, they have 40 FEINs, and none of the payments match the ones on the debt. Well, who is this? But it says the newspaper company, but we don't know which identity this really is. So what we do, they're shifting, putting the other hat back on, is, as a company, we go ahead and we look at them and say, we have this really large aggregated database that can go ahead and help and do a verification and accuracy check against, and just go ahead and help understand that in our own data, what we've done is we have several different layers of identifiers because we understand the problems that there are multiple FEINs out there for every company, and companies do have for different purposes multiple registrations in multiple states, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a really complex world. And so what we can do is then take the data and bounce it off the big database and say, oh, no, here's this common set of identifiers they can use, and here's all the other information like name, address, accountable official, et cetera. That's all to the right. So it all starts out with that key and that index number in front. Once all that data can get mapped to it, that's a way to go ahead and help increase the accuracy of the business data. I hope that addresses
Joe,
the question.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a great question because from what I hear these days, most agencies aren't just floating in money. So, Joe, are there tools out there that help you do this job better?
I would say in some ways for us at Do Not Pay, our tools are the data, and then our tools are our data scientists and our technologists who are helping to build different strategies, different algorithms that help to do a really effective job at identifying improper payments. And there are some tools and techniques that work really well for a lot of agencies. And then once you get down to particular programs that have unusual or unique or just requirements that are very specific to the nature of that program, you need really specialized tools. You need really specialized algorithms that speak to the particular requirements of that program.
Andrea, tools that you found effective?
So we use various technological algorithms, compliance with the Data Act. We have found that we have such a large quantity of data that we had to really look forward into the algorithms that we could use. But also we are testing or pilot testing some newer technology, as I said before, with regard to artificial intelligence, helping us use APIs to look at various data and also move forward in predictive analysis and trends for the data. So definitely we are still using some of our older technology, but we're definitely looking more into some of the later innovations in artificial intelligence.
Chris, we can't hear you. Is your mic still on?
Sorry, I muted, and I said so much great stuff. Sadif is down in Florida, and you could see my mouth moving and nothing coming out. That's the best word, let me tell you. Sadif is down in Florida, and Sadif, be safe down there. We know that it must be stressful. But he says, do you have any recommendations for staff, not part of the leadership, that makes the decisions on contractors for making sure that the data is accurate and that guidelines are followed? I know this is a big problem. How do you make sure that, the owners of the data need to make sure that it's the data correct? That's kind of stage one, isn't it? Joa, how do you deal with that?
So, obviously, if you are responsible for creating the data source of naughty entities or entities that have been registered with the United States, with the government, and are ready and able to assist, data entry is incredibly important, and it's tedious. I think there are opportunities to automate some of that, but there's an old expression, and everyone's heard it: garbage in, garbage out. So data entry is really important, and having a series of controls in place that will allow you to check and confirm, and that takes some of the data correction element at the beginning of the process that can sort of back up any data entry activities that you have going on and help you in an automated fashion to try up front to confirm the accuracy of your data would be a great thing. And then on the back end, most federal data sources have requirements that there has to be a process for which individuals and entities can correct their data. So if you believe that your data record is incorrect, perhaps it's not the news company or the newspaper company that owes a federal debt, but it's someone else. Maybe it's the magazine company, and somehow your records have gotten crossed, there needs to be a process at the data owner's location that you can correct that information. It's really important for citizens. It's really important for businesses.
Scott or Andrea, do you want to follow up on that?
I just add that we also make sure that we have certain data standards. So I can give you a very simple one. If you're putting in street, ST, in some data systems, and then you're actually spelling out STREET, and sometimes it makes it very difficult to reconcile those data points together, that we're talking about the same entity, the same street, the same address, but because we didn't standardize that particular data element, it makes it very difficult for us to reconcile the data and to ensure that it's accurate. So putting appropriate data standards in place is something that's very key that we found, and sometimes even doing that, you have different business owners that want to be standardized the way that they're accustomed to seeing it, and so we have to all come to the table and agree that this is going to be the standard across the department, and as you've seen in some of the other instances more recently across the government, we have to ensure that we agree on certain data standards and across different lines of businesses within the government. So I'd say data standardization is very key as well.
Awesome. Scott, you have anything to add? You were chuckling. Were you chuckling at my snoring dogs in the background?
No, I'm chuckling because everything Andrea is saying is just like, I love data standards because it's so important to just make sure, it sounds so simple, that make sure the name is in the name field, make sure the address is in the address field, and then make sure everything makes sense. And I know, I'm aware of some of the work, Andrea, you mentioned about the Data Act over there. I have to say, I'm in the Board of Advisors for the Data Coalition out there, and so it's everything involving the Data Act out there, and I've seen demonstrations from the Cedar Library that you guys put together to have consistent definitions across everything for grants that you do. And I look at it, I'm like, wow, the work that's being done out there, it's just fantastic because it's bringing consistency to it. Out there, you need to have a standard data because back in the day.
And I just want to pause you for 2 seconds because I think it's important to note how far we've come in this process. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're so focused on the next challenge that we forget how. I mean, I always joke that I've been covering this stuff since the Lincoln administration, and there's been a lot that's happened in terms of just using data and people understanding data, and we say that so quickly and almost offhanded, but that is so huge here.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it definitely is, because I look at it and I chuckle mostly because I only left Treasury 6.5 years ago, but it's just seeing all the work that's happened in the last 6.5 years, and it's like, oh my God, all these things have been done in such a short period of time.
Yeah,
it is rather remarkable.
Eric has a great question because he's from my hometown, San Mateo, California. He says, do you have systems in place to keep checks on your internal gatekeepers? Who watches the watchers? Joa, Andrea, do either of you have those kinds of systems in place?
I mean, I would say the federal government has a really robust system. Oh, go ahead, Chris. You want to repeat the question?
Well, you go first, and then I'll re-ask it to Andrea.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I do firmly believe that the federal government has a really strong system of checks and balances, not just the ones that we think of from, our high school government classes, but ways in which we are ensuring that we're all staying on the right path. So, there are always internal controls. Some of them are automated. Sometimes they're process oriented. There are internal audits that we all go through. And then, although there are sometimes a little bit of a contentious relationship, we do fundamentally in the executive agency rely on our inspectors general to come in and provide additional oversight and quality assurance, and they play a huge role in that. In addition, the U.S. Government Accountability Office also fulfills that role. So I think that we have a lot of different organizations that take both a high level and very detailed performance-oriented focus to ensure that we're all using data appropriately and that we are all doing our best to create systems that are working efficiently and effectively for government.
Andrea, the question was essentially, do you have systems in place to keep checks on your internal gatekeepers? Do we have her? Andrea, are you there? I don't see your. Oh, there you are. Did you hear the question, Andrea? Oh, she's frozen right now. So I'm going to move on it's okay. We'll come back. Scott, Lee from Cook County asks, what are some of the challenges and advice regarding vetting tools and the length of time it took for the culture to adopt the practice? Have you seen folks? I mean, we always talk about the change in culture, but how do you weave this in?
So I think what it comes down to is that you need to have internally, you need to have a champion internally with the data. Then it's always, it's very hard to be the first one to do it out there. So once you get in and explain it, because data, there's all these other laws and regulations that apply to the use of data too, that impacts government agencies. So what it comes down to is that there has to be a certain amount of openness out there. Because when I did it, back at Treasury, I helped start an analytics division that was there. But it was, no, we have all this data, it's just over here. But the data by itself is just there. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't talk. It doesn't interact. What we needed was a team of people to look at the data and start to analyze it and extract information out of it to help us do the jobs better. So it's really what it comes down to is just, if there's somebody out there that believes that, oh yeah, no, we need to do these things to help the government do their job better, you just kind of have to start doing it and show the margin, the incremental change and incremental value to it, and just kind of keep moving forward.
And Joa, it seems what I always have heard, and tell me if this is true, is start with some way where you get some quick wins, where you can show the value of doing this work, that this isn't just data for data's sake, but it actually matters.
That's absolutely true. I think when you are trying to stand up an analytics shop or a data shop, walking into it with a particular challenge and a partner who will work with you. And I always think of partners because Do Not Pay never works in isolation. We are only ever working with agencies to support them. So having a particular challenge that you're going to tackle right away and feeling pretty good that you know that your research tools and your data are going to speak to that, and making sure that that's not going to be a project that's going to go on for a year and a half before you have results. Yes, that is really important.
Andrea, are you still there? Did we get you back? Did you hear the question? There you are. Hi, Andrea. Did you hear the question? Basically, what are some of the challenges and advice regarding vetting tools and the length of time to essentially get this culture, to get people to get and appreciate and love their data as much as you do? Andrea, can you hear me?
No, I can hear you right now.
Okay. How do you give Lee and the team some advice? What are some of the challenges and advice regarding vetting tools and getting people to get data, to love data? I think she's still in and out. So
yeah, I'm going to take her out. I think her signal's really on bad.
Perfect. Eric, I'm going to go to another question. This comes from Eric at the Savannah River Nuclear, and I can't see the rest of it, but what a cool agency you work for. Could you explain how business data analytics can be used to conduct thorough vendor assessments to ensure you authenticate your supply chain security? Wow. Yeah, I know. Thank you, Eric, for the easy question. We're going to the easy ones. But have you seen, and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit if it's okay, Eric, but can you use data for those kinds of things that people have been worried about, things like supply chain for a long time? Have you seen, Scott, situations where people use data almost in ways that you didn't even anticipate?
Yeah, it happens to us out there a lot of times that there are customers who will call up and they'll say, hey, we have this unique problem. Can you help us solve this? And one of them actually is pretty similar. That was being described down in Savannah. Whereas you need to know, like, if there's some bad people out there, and they want to get stuff in places where they shouldn't out there, and that's the job. And so to make sure that people want to get access to facilities in places out there, you have to be able to vet, who's driving the truck, what is the company, what is it doing, who owns it, and all those other things, just to make sure. Because when it comes down to national security, there with that, you have to just be able to make that link and make the tie together, because before I mentioned the serial incorporator problem, this could be another example of it where not necessarily the serial incorporator, but who is actually behind that business, who actually owns it, and who are their relatives and associates as well. So being able to see the entire picture of that business and who wants to get access to the facility, that's something that's really important to be able to do, because if you get the wrong people coming in for the wrong purpose, things can get really ugly out there. So we want to just be able to prevent that. But it's definitely a challenge to do. It's not unsurmountable. It can be done. We do help some of our customers do that very thing.
Chris, could I pick up on that thought?
Yeah, absolutely. Go.
So I think one of the things that you and Scott both spoke to is this idea of how do we use different data sources? So data sources typically get created for a particular purpose. And culturally, I think many agencies have always sort of embraced the idea that if you collect data for a certain purpose, it can only be used for that purpose. And that's not really the case in the days of big data. You can't be oblivious to why data was collected, because that will help you to understand its accuracy, its reliability, why certain fields might be very well populated and others won't. But at the end of the day, the availability of data can help you to make determinations. So if I need to find out where an entity in the United States is registered, I may pull that from one data source, and it may or may not have been intended for the purposes of helping perhaps an auditor or an oversight agency, or even an organization like Do Not Pay, to make a determination about whether or not a payment to that organization is going to be appropriate. So the why data was collected, I think in the era of big data, matters less.
Yeah.
And that's a cultural shift that we need to get people to really embrace.
And yet people need to know to make sure that they're using data in the right way and not, I know there are certain rules and regulations around data collection and how you can share it even within agencies, right? And you need to at least be aware of that, right?
Absolutely. And that is, all data sources, at least government data sources, typically come with required uses or documented lists of appropriate uses. And so when the government is using data, it's really important that, and I think that most of us have a very strong program. It's typically our privacy program. We have privacy experts that help us to help guide us through appropriate uses of various data sources. So the why a data source might not matter to how you use it, but the rules and requirements around what the data's intended use as it was published, that's important.
Scott, do you want to comment on that before I'm going to check Andrea and see if we can hear her and her hear us. But Scott, did you want to comment on how you use this data? Data?
It's the use of the data. It's very different because we have a lot of government customers. And they all use it for different purposes. It kind of really depends. It's one of the things, that was always a frustration for me. It still is. There's a lot of laws that were written 40 so years ago.
Yeah.
They're like right when computers kind of began. IBM used to have mainframes that were whole big rooms and buildings, and now they're in the cloud. And so the data. Technology's moved on, and then the laws are really old. So I think there's also some element of is that the interpretation of those laws has changed over time, because 40, 50 years ago, well, things are written now that you can't use data to match against this data over here, can we refresh that now? Because time's moved on, things are different. That's
it was awesome. Last week was the last week before school, and I took my son to the Smithsonian. And they have one of those old IBM punch card systems. Actually, they have I don't think it's the whole thing, but they have a chunk of it. And it was like, oh my goodness, it's amazing. Now on my iPhone, I have more computing capability. So it's just amazing how far we've come. Yeah. Andrea, can you hear us? You're back. It's so nice to see you again. Can you hear us? And are you working? I'm going to ask you a question that Carlos sent in. In terms of data merging, can you discuss how you develop programs to link different data with different sources? Do you this data merging, and it's a little bit what we've been just talking about, is how you use different data in different ways. But have you found a good way of pulling all these together?
As far as data merging goes, we definitely still have to use a manual methodology with our subject matter experts to be very careful that we are actually merging the right data together, or the right programmatic data. We want to ensure that, I think Joa was talking about certain data was created for a specific purpose, and so a lot of our data were created for different specialized programmatic purposes. When we find that the data can be melded together, or it appears that the programs may be a little bit duplicative, or they are similar, and we want to try to merge data together, we have to be very, very careful. And so while we may have an algorithm that may identify similar data, before we actually meld it together, we do have to have a manual intervention with the subject matter experts to ensure that we're not merging, that the appropriate process for merging the data together results in reliable data. We don't want to do something or then take perfectly reliable data and then create something on the.
I'm going to step in just because she's breaking up a little bit, but while you're still here, I just did an interview. For our. We do a series of talking to finalists for the Service to America medals, this amazing award. One of them is from HHS, and they managed to get and convict this doctor who was accused of giving cancer patients, people telling them that they had cancer when they may not have, and then giving them cancer drugs just in order to collect the money. Can you imagine, as somebody with cancer, how much it must suck to go through chemo when you may not even have cancer? This bad guy has been put away. It started with a tip, but then they used data to chase it down, and it's an amazing story, and glad they're getting recognized for it. Joa, talk a little bit about what Carlos was asking about in terms of just this, how do you merge the data together? This is it feels like the 400 level class in terms of data, right?
Sometimes there's a lot of, so I guess from just speaking from a technical perspective and not sort of getting into the when should you do it, when should you not, there are a lot of crafty things that you can do to essentially use a data field as a unique identifier and to link records based on that unique identifier. It doesn't have to be a social security number. It could be something else. It could be your name. And then the next trick, and this is sort of what Scott had talked a little bit about earlier, is, data records in different data sources often have variation, either because someone spelled my name wrong. Everybody spells my name wrong. My iPhone thinks I'm Josh, not Joa. We have a bad relationship. But you can imagine if how many different permutations of my name there are. And so I fully expect that across many data sources, my name is spelled all sorts of different ways. So if the only thing that you had in common across a series of data sources was your name, instead of just trying to link those records based on an exact spelling, you might want to use some algorithms that would allow for a certain amount of variation. And so that would be the 400 level technical class, I think.
Scott, did you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, so I think to echo the point Joe said about the unique identifier there, and what we do as a company, when we aggregate that together, we try to take care of all the fuzziness, because people, at the end of the day, there's usually a human doing data entry. There's usually where it starts. So people mistype all the time and things like that. So when you do it, when you're creating the big databases, you have to kind of move slowly as well. You constantly have to have quality checks going on to make sure that the data is accurate and it's very consistent across the data fields too. So you joke all the time about make sure the name is in the name field, make sure the address is in the address field. It's simple stuff like that. So when you go to join, it's definitely, if you have some sort of indicator, it could be an alphanumeric number, it could be just a numeric number, just an alpha number, whatever that unique identifier is, that it really is the key to the whole system. So choose that one wisely. They're definitely advised there, and make sure it's constantly do a lot of quality assurance checks.
We haven't talked about security of data, and Benish, I hope I'm getting your name right, he's in Texas. He says sometimes the data is unavailable due to security concerns, or cause of the data is not always accurate. How can we best address the accuracy in these situations. So I'm going to Benish, I hope I'm going to take your question in two ways. One is, how do you keep, once you get all this data together, as OPM has proved to us, data that we may not necessarily knew was important all of a sudden becomes very important if you pull it together in the right way. But also, how do you, sometimes you reach walls and you're not able to get the data that you need in order, because of security concerns. And Joe, how do you deal with security? There you go.
Well, I mean, I think cybersecurity is obviously an ongoing challenge for the federal government. It's something that I think all of us are really invested in. No one wants to have a data breach. I mean, that's one of the worst things that when you are working in especially a data-centric field like the ones that Andrea and I and Scott are all working in, a data breach would be devastating. So we take data security very seriously. And, I think the focus on developing more modern technology, I think that's a challenge for the federal government, is that, much of our infrastructure, our technological infrastructure is aging.
Yeah.
And
those punch cards are getting really old and tired now.
Right. I guess at least with the punch cards, if you unplug it, you're good to go.
Right, exactly.
That's not necessarily a good thing from data availability, but you can make it secure that way. So I think focusing on, to the extent that there are opportunities to modernize our IT system, and again, I think there are a broad number of cybersecurity initiatives across the federal government to make sure that we're securing data, looking for opportunities to partner with private industry. All of those things would be good strategies to continue forward with.
Scott, address cyber for a little bit. Both security, both in terms of keeping data safe once you have all this together, but also Barish's question, which was more about, hey, is somebody securing their data and then all of a sudden I don't have access to it? You must have seen this.
Yeah, so it's back to what I said before about the data being the new oil. It's highly valuable information. That once everything went digital, you have to do it. So I'm not necessarily a data security expert on it, but what we do, I just know a little bit familiar with some of our practices, you have to just have the most up-to-date security standards at all times, because the people out there trying to perpetrate breaches, they're doing checks all the time, because they'll know, oh, here's these patches that are coming, there's a weakness here, they're going to go ahead and write code, et cetera, to try to go ahead and exploit it. So you have to be able to make sure that all the doors and windows are locked at all times, in the database. And I'm not really sure about how to address the second question about how do you get to the data that you can no longer get to. I think that's what I'm hearing. I'm not really sure how to address that one.
Tough challenge. It's one that I hadn't heard of before either. So, Arish, you stumped the band. Nice job.
Yeah.
We're rapidly running out of time. And Scott, I know that in the follow-up, I mentioned that there'll be a follow-up email that folks will get this whole an on-demand version of this conversation. But there's also some stuff that you guys are going to put along with it. Tell them what are they going to get? Sure.
So what we did is we partnered with the Data Foundation, the research arm of the Data Coalition, and we're publishing a paper. It's going to be next week, so this is like, spoiler alert.
Hot off the presses.
Hot off the presses, even before they get it. But they agreed that it'd be okay today, to go ahead and get it out and spread the word on it. But what we talk about in that research paper we did, the title is "Who is Who and What is What: The Need for Universal Entity Identification in the United States." And what we do is we go through that, and then we explore all the different types of unique identifiers that exist, not just in government, not just in procurement, but just available in general there. We get into a lot about what happened in the past, right after the financial crisis, when Lehman Brothers didn't know who owed who money and when. They had 7,000 different entities around the world there, and sometimes around each end of the trade. So we get into that, we explore all that, because that's all this stuff about business data. Andrea alluded to it right at the beginning, about all the data that's internal too, out there to keep it organized. That was essentially one of Lehman's problems, was when things started to unravel, what were they attached to? So all that gets discussed is that there's so many different unique identifiers out there. Well, what if we just had one unique identifier to rule them all? And that's what the theme of the paper.
Yeah, wouldn't that be it'd be a different world, right?
I think it would be great.
As I mentioned, we're quickly running out of time. Well, I want to get one other question in before I ask you guys to wrap up. we always hear agencies talk about silos and how they deal with silos. And I know that there are data silos. And I think that was a little bit what Barish was talking about, even if it's not security, but people who get locked in their silos, right? And sometimes we don't always play well in the sandbox. How do you deal with those kinds of things, Joe? How do you break through those silos? We haven't found many effective ways in other parts of government. So how do you deal with it in the data world?
There's no technical solution for that. I think at the end of the day,
wouldn't it be nice if there were?
It would be nice. Algorithms are easy and reliable. I think the way that you break down any silo is you have to learn about what else is going on in your organization. You have to talk to your colleagues. You have to go to other organizations, events to understand what kind of challenges they're working on, and you need to think creatively about how their information might be able to help solve some of the challenges that you are facing. We actually instituted within fiscal service an analytics community of practice, and while we're all not working on the same things, sharing these use cases really has inspired some creative thinking and also some realizations that there may be ways for us to better leverage and get more value out of the data that is already housed within fiscal service.
Scott, data silos. How do you get out of those silos?
Well, I think doing what Joe has said that was a very excellent answer.
Yeah.
Sometimes following is always hard, but what we did, same thing out there is you have to be able to go out and talk with your colleagues and talk with other people out there, because odds are everybody's having the same challenges. And this is, again, I alluded to it before out there, but it's a legislative problem. There's a policy discussion that kind of needs to happen too, because data can be aggregated together and used out there, so you could do that. And that's one of those other things that I think we need to have happen, is that we'll take a look at the legislations that's out there and make sure that you can unlock all that data in the silos, because Joe is right. There are algorithms that can be written out there, but kind of back to what Andrea said before, is that once there's a data standard, then the algorithms built upon a data standard become really powerful to knock down all the silos. I think that, that's one of the things that I would really like to see happen.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we only have like a minute and a half left, so I'm going to ask you to quickly just leave people with a thought as we've talked about so many different areas, but leave them with something, Joe, leave them with something that can help them do their jobs better. How can they think about this stuff in a way that really becomes more effective as they move forward?
Well, I would say if you're at a federal agency, I'm going to put in a plug for the Do Not Pay Business Center. We love to try to help with improper payments challenges. This is something that all government cares about, and we are a free resource that can assist with that.
And the amount of improper payments is huge. Now, government is a huge organization, but it's a lot of money, and my goodness, we need money going to the right places these days. So yeah, thank you. And Scott, give people, pull it out. You get to wrap it all up in a nice big bow and give it to folks as a gift. Give them a data gift.
Sure. I think what I really like to see out there is echoing what we just said about making sure the data, that quality is there, making sure it's very accurate, there do consistent checks on it out there, and having a consistent unique identifier out there to help make sure all the data is accurate, as well as having very consistent data standards and data definitions out there, because at the end of the day, business name should really mean business name out there. It's as simple as that.
Always start with 101, right? Before you start moving on to the 400. We all love to focus on the 400 level stuff, but start with 101.
Yeah.
It's the stuff that really matters. That is Scott Straub. He is Director of Federal Market Strategy at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and also Joa. I'm going to miss it now. Ayata. Oh, yeah, there you go. She's Director of the Do Not Pay Business Center at the Treasury Department's Bureau of Fiscal Service. And joining us earlier was Andrea Brandon. She is Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Grants, Acquisitions, Policy, and Accountability at the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you guys for doing this. Really appreciate it. A quick reminder that we will send you the on-demand version of this session within a few days. So you have it, you can share it, do whatever you want. And Scott told you some of the other cool stuff. Hot off the presses. Do they have presses anymore? Well, if we had presses, it would be hot off of it. So you'll get that next week. Thank you so much for participating in this video webcast, Why Business Data Accuracy is Important for Government. We thank you, and go out and do good work.